thinking of these news story things and stuff like that. You know, you having a good time? You able to relax over the summer, have a good time?
Am I able to have a good time? My cat just had a heart attack.
Are you serious?
Yeah, he had a heart. You ever hear such a crazy thing?
No, I didn't know they got things like that.
Yeah, they get heart attacks. So I got it off Steve Corrin, this writer up at
Sure,
Saturday Night
I know
Live.
him, yeah.
Yeah, so he gives me his cat. Turns out it's some kind of a defective cat, you know? So he's a nice cat and everything. I'm getting along with him. I come back to my apartment last week. The cat's like foaming at the mouth. He's shaking like this. He's foam coming out. So I didn't want to get near it. I thought maybe he'd, you know, who knows? He was delirious. Maybe he'd think I'm a mouse. So I said, I didn't want to get near him. So I phoned 911. You know, I panicked. I phoned 911.
Right.
Which it turns out it's just for people. I didn't know that.
Didn't know either.
They got mad, man. They said they would have me arrested if I phoned back.
Oh, okay.
But anyways, you know, I love this cat. It's a good cat. So I took him down. I got him in a cab, and I took him down to the hospital, the animal hospital. And the guy tells me, my cat had a heart attack. He takes him away. He says, oh, yeah, he had cardiac arrest and stuff. And he started asking me questions about, like, he says, I said, what would cause that? He goes, you know, diet, stress.
Stress?
Yeah. Well, he had a big promotion coming up. So, and then he let me visit the cat. He says, you can visit the cat, you know. There's visiting hours. I go, all right. So you go in this room, and then they bring the cat in a cage. He's all drugged up. And then they put the cat, like, on a bed. And then the guy goes, okay, we'll be back in a half an hour. You have half an hour, you know? So I'm with the cat, like, for half an hour. So after 5 minutes, you know, I figured, I got a life to get back to. You know, it's a cat. So we go out, and so afterwards he told me he had a lot of, he said he could have an operation, which was like $4,000, which, you know, I could buy like 100 cats for that, you know? But then I figured, what the hell would I do with 100 cats?
Right. So you got the cat. You sprung for the operation.
No, I didn't.
Oh.
No, there was another thing where he's on medication, you know, and I have him on medication. I have this medication. And he said there was some good news and bad news. He said the bad news was the cat only has like a 20% chance of survival, but he says the good news is it's just a cat.
Classic. Welcome everyone to Readout. Alrighty. Thank you for joining us on a Sunday evening. Christian, how you doing tonight?
Good, man. Good. How about you guys?
Doing great.
Fantastic.
John, how are you?
Glad to be here. Good. As I struggle to open a bottle of body armor.
Now, remind me, is body armor like a pre-workout?
No. It's just it might as well be a tasty drink with no calories. That's literally it. It's kind of a sweet drink. They claim like, oh, you know, it has like whatever vitamins and minerals you need. No, it's just a nice tasting drink.
Yeah, the bottle looks, I don't know, kind of like a fruity kombucha or something. I'm one to talk. I'm drinking a bright orange drink here. This is a Naked and Famous, which is Aperol, lime juice.
You couldn't have picked a more fruity name for that.
Dude, you're lucky you're married, man.
Great branding. Yeah, I know. It does help. It does help.
First Henry Cavill's dreamy, then you're drinking, what was it, Naked and Famous?
Naked and Famous, my friend, yeah.
Naked and
No,
Famous.
it's Aperol, lime juice, mezcal, and one other ingredient that's escaping me. Oh, yellow chartreuse normally, although I actually make it with a substitute. But
You know, I make fun of you, but I probably would like it myself. So
it's quite tasty, and it doesn't taste fruity at all. It's just it's got a funny looking color, but it's quite good. The smokiness in the mezcal really comes through. Alrighty. Well, today's topic is perhaps a little bit heavy, but appropriate for a Sunday evening. We've got a few video clips pulled up. I put together a PowerPoint slide just to help organize my thoughts. I want to walk through something of a survey of the different ideas around the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or communion, or Christian, what's a distinctly Catholic term for it?
Transubstantiation.
Well, sure, yeah, or the host, or I'm just trying to think of a mass. I guess you just call it mass.
Communion.
Yeah.
Mass. Yeah.
Mass. Right. So it goes by many names, but this thing that we all do as Christians, some more than others, and there's a lot of different practices, a lot of different doctrines around it, and I think it's worth. There's a lot of misconceptions as well, so I want to cover all of that. I have a slightly unique way of approaching the survey. That's a little bit different from the sort of the classic 4 views approach. Although I can map those 4 views onto the way I like to talk about it. So I think the discussion will be a little different than what you've normally heard, although very much consistent with the classic dialogue on the Lord's Supper. So happy to dive in here and happy to have you all along for the ride. We got several people in the chat, so thanks for joining us. Evening sickers. Alrighty.
That's a joke
why,
that other people
that
won't
one
get
to
unless
read.
unless they're blind people. Yeah.
That's true. That's
I did set up some very funny stream alerts for my own stream, but they're not appropriate for this stream, so we're not doing that here.
Yeah, we have to be careful about the crossover. Alrighty. So I think probably the best way to dive in is maybe to play the Pints with Aquinas clip that Christian put up, where he's going over a few of the historical figures that have talked about it. And we can just start at the point where I put a timestamp in there for when he launches into that.
Yeah, it's the what early Christians believed about the Eucharist with Matt Fred. Should we give a very brief, actual overview for people who may not know? I imagine everyone does, but I think something I was talking with Christian about is that a lot of Protestants don't even know what it is or what it's supposed to be or the different views on it, especially if you come from a really laissez-faire Baptist or non-denom sort of background. It's for most people they're it's a symbol, it's just a remembrance ceremony or something like that. It's not actually anything real whatsoever. It is just like a memorial, basically.
Well, that is part of the question, isn't it? So there are just a few terms that you'll hear thrown around, and this is kind of the initial intro to Matt Frad's video, and I'll get into it in more detail later, but typically Protestants have a more symbolic view of the Lord's Supper. So the Lord's Supper is when the body and blood of Christ represented in the bread and wine that we take when we practice the Lord's Supper, practice communion. And Protestants tend to have a more symbolic view of it, where meaning symbolic in the sense that when we interpret Christ's words of "this is my body" in a symbolic fashion, whereas Catholics view it more literally, is a word that gets used, but what actually literally means is a topic of some debate, and that's one thing I'm going to get into. But they see it as not being just symbolic or metaphorical, and there are a number of views in between as well. But the doctrine of transubstantiation in the Catholic view is that the bread and the wine actually do not transform, that's not the right word, but the
substance of it transforms.
Exactly.
But the physical presence of it is still bread and wine.
Right. So we're going to get into the accident substance distinction later on, because that is very, very complicated.
Yeah. So we will touch on a little bit of Hellenistic philosophy as well. So that's enough, I think, to get folks in the door, and all these things we will cover in more detail. Let's roll the clip.
Well, it would help if I actually pulled it up here first.
Look more closely at the details of the text. However, we need to be sure that we are reading the text the way that the ancient audience did, and that means it's useful to look to what the earliest Christians believed. If, for example, the earliest Christians believed that when Christ said, "This is my body, this is my blood," he meant it metaphorically, and the Catholic belief in the real, literal presence is completely unheard of until the Middle Ages, then it would make sense to me to go with the more ancient interpretation. Conversely, If it can be shown that the early church did believe unanimously in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and the view that the Eucharist is merely a symbol was basically unheard of until the last few centuries, well, then again, I think it makes more sense to go with that ancient belief. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not equating the writings of the early Christians with the Bible. The Bible is the
Well, one thing I did want to say about this is that a lot of the times in Protestant circles, like even a very famous pastor like Francis Chan, I talked to Christian about this again a little bit before the stream started, but somebody who most Protestants, I would say, not all, but most Protestants are very unaware of any historical interpretations or, the way that the early church ran or what the church fathers actually believed. This is post-apostolic, but still within that same time frame, some of the very early church fathers actually thought about the different sacraments, the reading of the text, the way you exegete things, right? So not looking at it from a modern interpretation, but from people that are much closer to the actual source. Some of these people actually knew some of the apostles, specifically like John and whatnot. If you, I might get the name wrong, but some of them are very, very close to the actual apostles themselves, what they believed. And the reason why I bring up Francis Chan is because Francis Chan, who is somebody I remember watching in high school, people would do like his video series on like love and whatnot. And then just a few years ago, he came to the conclusion that like, looking back at the church fathers, they actually believed in like a real presence. And again, this is somebody who's been a pastor for like 20, 30 years and had just, I guess, never been taught or never looked into what the early church actually believed about the Eucharist and communion and whatnot. So I think that this is something that is drastically underserved in Protestantism.
Yeah, it's a conversation that we don't often have. Well, Presbyterians do have this conversation, but Protestants writ large, I think, very often
I think
neglect it.
Yeah, specifically, like Presbyterian, Anglican, Lutheran all have a higher view of it. They're more high church. They have that reputation. And then it's like Baptists, historically shaky, and then non-denom, almost nothing.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way that it goes.
I've seen
so
churches where they would just hand you bread and wine to go on your way out the door, which is just
right. Well, and yeah, so as somebody who was raised Baptist, like it was, whether it was once a month or every week, depending on what church, they would have a different regiment for how they issued it, but it was always a memorial. I'd never even heard about like real presence until I was like a late teenager or something like that. When somebody said, "Oh, Catholics believe in transubstantiation," and I'm like, I don't know what that word means, but cool.
But to your point, James, I remember going to non-denominational like mega churches with my mom back in the day when I was young, and they would literally just like tear off a piece of a bread and hand you some Welch's grape juice on your way out the door. So that's actually how they usually do it. So
yeah. I mean, I think that most Protestants, like classical Protestants, are all spiritual presence of different variants. It's really only the non-denoms and some Baptists where they kind of say, well, it's purely symbolic. There is no real or spiritual presence.
right.
So,
And that's where I think we're going to see in the reading of the church fathers here, I suspect, I haven't actually watched this video ahead of time, but I suspect that they're all going to say something along the lines of, it's really there, or it's real, but that is sort of the question. I mean, assuming Zwingli is out, right? Zwingli is the first one to really pose the mere memorial concept. Assuming that that's ahistorical, the question still remains, what does Christ's body being really present mean? What does really mean in that context, or in any context to some degree? There are some pretty fundamental metaphysical concepts that we have to address to really even understand the different viewpoints. So we'll get into it.
Inspired and inerrant word of God. The writings of the early Christians are not. Individual early Christian writers no doubt believed and even taught errors. But the early church fathers were closer in time and culture to the apostles, and they shed important light on the question of how the original audience would have understood the text. Also, what they wrote concerning the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is what was handed on to them from the apostolic age, and they handed that down to us through 100 successive generations. So, what did they hand down to us? Well, we only have time in this short video to take a look at 4 early Christians. But in the description below, I'm going to share many more, so please be sure to check that out. The first early Christian we'll look at is Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who lived in the 1st century and likely heard the preaching of the apostles, particularly Saint John. Ignatius was named Bishop of Antioch during a time when being a Christian in the Roman Empire was punishable by death, and he was actually sentenced to public execution by wild beasts. In his letter to the Christians at Smyrna, he tells them not to associate with certain Gnostic heretics who denied that Christ really became man. In it, he discusses the Eucharist. Here's what he says. "Take note of those who hold heterodox opinions on the grace of Jesus Christ which has come to us, and see how contrary their opinions are to the mind of God. They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they do not confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Saviour Jesus Christ, flesh which suffered for our sins and which the Father in his goodness raised up again." Next, we'll look at Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who was named Bishop of Jerusalem in AD 350 and who participated at the Council of Constantinople in 381. He was a great defender of the faith against the heresy of Arianism, which is the idea that there was a time when God the Son did not exist. Here's what Saint Cyril wrote about the Eucharist. "The bread and wine of the Eucharist before the holy invocation of the adorable Trinity were simple bread and wine. But the invocation having been made, the bread becomes the body of Christ and the wine the blood of Christ." The third early Christian I want to look at is Saint Ambrose of Milan, who was named Bishop of Milan in AD 374. It was Saint Ambrose who helped save Saint Augustine from remaining a Gnostic heretic. Listen to what Ambrose has to say. "Perhaps you may be saying, 'I see something else. How can you assure me that I am receiving the body of Christ? It but remains for us to prove it. And how many are the examples we might use? Christ is in that sacrament because it is the body of Christ." The fourth and final early Christian I want to look at is Saint Augustine, who was named Bishop of Hippo in modern Algeria in AD 396 and is held in great esteem by both Catholics and Protestants alike. Here's what he had to say about the Eucharist. "What you see is the bread and the chalice. That is what your own eyes report to you. But what your faith obliges you to accept is that the bread is the body of Christ and the chalice is the blood of Christ." This short list of 4 early Christians is enough for now, but you can find more quotes in the description below. Of these 4 early Christians, one lived in the 1st century and likely heard the preaching of the apostles themselves during the time of the early persecutions of Christians, and the other 3 lived in the 4th and 5th centuries during a time of great confusion in the church. When Saint
And I'm not sure how much further you want to go in there, but that's basically just kind of laying the foundation of the early church fathers and some of their positions on it. Now you can find, let me see, because I pulled them up, you can find some quotes as well that don't necessarily line up with the transubstantiation, although Catholics will argue back and forth on that. So I did pull up some of those quotes if you wanted to go over those at all, or if James wanted to move on to something else.
Yeah, well, let me just kind of launch into the PowerPoint, and then we can kind of come back to some of the other clips. But I think just sort of to lay the groundwork, I think that might be helpful. So let me try sharing my screen here. This is my first time. By the way, is my it was cutting out a little bit in the video for me. Is that just my connection, or were you guys also?
It sounded good to me.
Yeah, your audio's fine.
Okay. I think it might just be my connection's a little tentative. All right, so we're sharing screen. Let's see.
Well, so before you get into that, I think, as Full Metal Jackal says, in other words, the early church took it quite literally. There might be some variation of spiritual versus real, or the distinctions therein, but I will say that it appears that none of them believed it was purely symbolic.
Yeah.
So that modern interpretation is completely ahistorical. You can argue variations maybe between real and spiritual in some of the church fathers, but you can't argue the not real, just symbolic. I don't think that's a
Right.
historical interpretation at all.
Because when you're looking at like a moment of change, right, where the invocation is given and something actually technically changes, that's certainly going beyond just a symbolic change. If it is just something that you do in remembrance, then there wouldn't be any particular importance to the invocation. So yeah, I think that is a novel view. Can you guys see my screen?
Let me pull it up on. I got it.
Oh.
I can get it. Take him off. Add that to stage. There it is. We got it.
Okay. Alrighty. All right. So Christ. The main dispute is around Christ's words, "This is my body," and so the key question is: in what way are the bread and wine truly the body and blood of Christ? Because I think we would all agree that they are the body and blood of Christ in some sense. So the question is, in what sense? And so this is where I would propose 4 different answers that different people will give. And these don't map exactly to the classic 4 views that you'll hear people talk about. So I will get to those in a second, but I'll just list them out right now. The typical, when you pick up, like there's a book, I don't know if it's Crossway or one of the other Christian publication houses, has a book called 4 Views on the Lord's Supper, and it's just basically a written debate by a number of different theologians. But you'll see the mere memorial view, the real spiritual presence view, which is typically associated with Calvin, the consubstantiation view, that's the Lutheran view, and then the transubstantiation view, which is the Catholic view. So those are the typical 4 views that you will see talked about. I have a slightly different, the 4 that I'm going to put up here are a little different, but I will go back and map those 4 back onto this. So again, we're answering the question, in what way are the bread and wine the body and blood of Jesus Christ? And so the first answer that you'll see Christians give is symbolically only. That's the mere memorial view. So that is the Zwinglian perspective that maps pretty much directly. But even diehard Baptists that do see it as being purely symbolic don't much like the term mere in terms of memorial, so they might still call it. They might still really believe that it's only symbolic, but they still want to elevate the symbol. That they want to talk about it as being a very important symbol, being a high symbol. They don't want to talk about it as being a mere memorial. But when you press them in terms of the importance of the symbol, it is in what it symbolizes. The thing itself doesn't have much importance. The ritual itself doesn't have much importance beyond what it points to, and so I think that's it's kind of like
well, in kind of a weird way, doesn't that make the bread and wine almost like an icon in that way, where it's merely a prototype, or it refers to the prototype, not to itself?
Well, yeah, I mean that is sort of the attack against transubstantiation or the higher views of the Lord's Supper, is that they are idolatrous, is that they replace veneration of God with veneration of this earthly thing, which seems to be a direct contradiction of what we're supposed to do. But of course, if it is really the body and blood of Christ, then perhaps we are supposed to direct it there. But then aren't we doing the classic mistake that all pagans make of taking God's creation and pretending that is God? But then if Christ said, "This is my body," then maybe this is licit in this one instance. Yeah, so you'll see some different shades around the mere memorial perspective, or the symbolically only. But I think that generally the trueness of the statement, "This is my body," is in the symbolism, the power that it has, because they'll still talk about it as being powerful, but the power that it has is in being the ultimate true symbol. And, it's a true symbol of Christ's body and what Christ did for us, and so it's powerful in that sense, in that it directs us to Christ and his power, but it has no power in and of itself. It has no incarnate power. It has no power in the actual taking of the ritual, which does, to some degree, raise the question, why do we even need to take it at all? Could you just, if it's purely symbolic or purely spiritual, could you just spiritually participate in the Lord's Supper? Could you just think about Christ's death and resurrection and be doing just as well? Which in practice is often how it comes out in the lives of many Baptist, non-denominational, lower Eucharistic views. Any other thoughts on that one before I go on?
No, I think that's good.
All right. So again, we're answering the question: in what way are the bread and wine the body and blood of Christ? And so these are additive, by the way. So each one doesn't necessarily take away from the earlier ones, but it just adds to it. And so the second answer I see is symbolically and truly. So now we're talking about it is a symbol, but it's more than just a symbol. So we do take it as a memorial. We do take it as in remembrance of Christ. Christ says that, do this in remembrance of me. So there is at least that significance, but there's something more. So this is kind of the anti-mere perspective. So it's not a mere memorial, but it is still a memorial. But it could also even go beyond that, where this truly could encapsulate the real spiritual presence that Calvin talks about. But it could also be less than that. It's unclear. Well, we'll get into this a little bit, but the distinction between real presence and real spiritual presence is a lot less fuzzy. And if you just make it all about the spiritual side of it and not about the actual fact that you go through the motions and you do the thing in a ritualistic way, then you're really a lot closer to the symbolically only perspective than a higher view. So this is just adding to the symbolism by saying that it truly is the body and blood of Christ. But then we still have to explain what that even means. And so then the third answer is symbolically and truly and literally. Now this is where it gets a little tricky, because the word literally is an incredibly tricky word, almost impossible to define, somewhat famously. So just to look at the etymology for a second, etymology meaning the source of the word, literal is derived from the word for letter. And what are letters if not symbols, right? Letters are symbols of things. And so to say that something is literally true is a lot less clear than we think. And I'll get into this a little bit more in the metaphysical side of things, but the best definition that someone can give for the word literally is usually in contrast to something else, in contrast to metaphorical. Okay, so now you have literal and you have metaphorical. But if you do an actual language analysis, what you realize is that a lot of the things that we now treat as literal statements and idioms at one point were metaphorical. There's an interesting study around the word breath. At one point, the word breath used to be the same word that would be used for spirit. And it's unclear at what point that branched off. But I don't think that we should look back and say that the older generations were simply much more poetic, and they saw our literal breath and spirit as being, or they would always speak in these metaphorical terms. It's actually, there's a theory that they really saw these two things as being one thing. Like our breath and this concept of spirit were actually one concept. That's why they just had one word for it. And so the point is, a lot of our literal language was at one point metaphorical, and a lot of our metaphorical language might in some sense be a lot more literal than we think. And so it's very hard to pin down what this word literally means, and especially when you apply it to the concept of transubstantiation, where you're talking about something, and again, we'll get into this a little bit more, but the details you have, it's transubstantiation, not transformation. The substance has changed. And so in Hellenistic philosophy, you have the substance of something, and then you have the accidents. And in the accidents being all of the things that we can interact with our five senses, and the substance being the thing itself. So, for example, when a leaf changes color, the accidents have changed. The way you see it has changed, but the leaf is still itself. This gets more complicated when you talk about personhood. So for instance, if you have some sort of a Freaky Friday event where two people swap minds, who is the person, right? Can you even say that so-and-so is now in someone else's body and vice versa? That's a very interesting philosophical question that doesn't have a clear answer. Probably the reason it doesn't have a clear answer is because that kind of event could never happen. Like it is, we are hylomorphic beings. We are body and soul, or body and spirit, in one entity. You can't. It's unnatural to separate us. And the only time we do seem to separate the soul and the body is in death. But you don't then go and inhabit another body. But you are separated from your physical being. But that's an unnatural state. The more natural state is what will be the final eternal state in heaven, in the new heaven and the new earth, when we actually get bodies again. And so this in between state that we do seem to, there is clear evidence, biblical evidence that we do go into, where we are just spirits for a little while. That is a less natural state in some respects than even our current state, where we have body and soul united. And then,
so this the Aristotelian methodology is going to be very important when talking about transubstantiation, because Aquinas draws directly from Aristotle. So people were saying, "Oh no, not another Greek lesson" in chat, but it's the reason why is because Aquinas borrows directly from Aristotle on his methodology.
Yeah, it does play a big role. The last one here is symbolically and truly and literally and physically. Now, this perspective is actually held officially by no one. If by physical we mean that the accidents transform or change in addition to the substance of the thing. No one really believes that when you eat the bread, it transforms miraculously into body tissue. You will see certain examples, what they'll call Eucharistic miracles, where people will say that it did change into heart tissue later, but that's seen as extraordinary. That is not an example of what is supposed to normally take place. The actual accidents of the bread and the wine are supposed to remain, and yet the substance changes. The substance is what changes. And to go back to number 3, where we're talking about, Catholics use the word literally, so it's literally true that this is the body of Christ. But if we're talking about something that is true of the essence but not the accidents, that sounds a lot like spiritual. That sounds a lot like the spiritual thing has changed, but everything material remains the same, which is basically what they mean by transubstantiation. And it's hard to parse that in any clear way without getting really into the weeds of Aristotelian philosophy, how to distinguish that from like a real spiritual presence. And so that's where I think the difference between 2 and 3 is not clear at all, or it's a lot less clear than a lot of people think. And like I said, no one really believes in 4. No one believes that in the everyday case of taking the Lord's Supper, you are eating a material body and blood. So we're really talking about something amaterial. We're talking about something that is beyond the accidents, and that sounds a lot like just spiritual. Anyways, so it gets a lot more fuzzy. And so if you can put Calvin somewhere between 2 and 3, which I think you could, I think Calvin wouldn't even necessarily deny 3. He might not use the word literal, but the distinction between 2 and 3 is really unclear. And I think you could fit Calvin, Luther, Catholics, Orthodox, all somewhere between 2 and 3. And the exact distinctions are a lot less stark than many people realize, even people within those sects. Any thoughts so far?
Just one quick thing. Were you meant to be switching between slides on your display?
You should just be seeing more things building up.
It hasn't changed for us.
No.
What are you seeing?
Just the
homepage.
slide one. Slide one. I don't know if
Oh,
you're in
well,
preview mode.
Okay, well, that's disappointing. Yeah, I am.
See, that changes when you click on those.
What do you see now?
Now you're on
Second
slide
slide.
2.
me just stop sharing and reshare.
Okay.
Okay, so now it is joined side too. All right. Yeah, it must be my internet, but let me just share again.
If you want to, you could just email it to me and I can pull it up. If that works for you.
Yeah, I can do that. Can you guys? Is it resharing?
Yeah, it's resharing. I see it now. It's on slide 2.
Okay. So slide 2. So you should see the last thing on the slide should be what is the difference between number 2 and number 3?
Well, it's not full screen. I don't know if you mean to have it full screen or not, but it's not. So like we see like the slides on the left and then
it is
the
on my
smaller
end.
image
So
in the middle.
it must just be my internet connection.
Really?
Yeah. Let me just send it to you. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Sorry about that, guys.
No, you're good.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. Just send it your way.
All right, let me know when you send it over. I'll pull it up. Reformed Renegade says, no, Calvin believed the imparted grace for believers only. Luther believed anyone who takes the Eucharist receives Christ. I believe Calvin made the analogy, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's like a bottle with a cork on it. So you can take the items, but you don't actually receive what is inside. Because if you're not a Christian, you don't have access to that. You don't have that spiritual gift to receive the Eucharist, like in the spiritual presence sense.
Yeah, the effects of taking it in different states is going to be something that there will be some disagreements on, and there are some big disagreements more in the beyond the question of transubstantiation in terms of the sacrificial nature of the Lord's Supper. That is a key difference. I think a much more significant difference. The point I'm making here is just with regard to the concept of transubstantiation, not with regard to really any of the other doctrines around the Lord's Supper, but just with regard to what actually happens, and answering the question, the body and blood of Christ, how are they really how are the bread and wine really the body and blood of Christ? That's specifically the question I'm addressing, because that is one that there's a lot of misconceptions around. All right, John, that's going your way.
Okay, perfect.
Do you want to play another clip in the meantime?
Well, we did. Do you want to do the Aristotle versus Kant clip? I have that one pulled up, or do you want to save that
that's short.
for a little bit? Okay,
we
it's about 2
can
minutes.
yeah, it's short, so we can play that.
Okay, let me put this one up.
To be true of. Now, that's an important difference between Plato and Aristotle, but their agreement is much more important than their difference. Nominalism, which denies the objective reality of universal forms entirely, departs from both Plato and Aristotle far more than they depart from each other. The relation between Plato and Aristotle is like the relation between Protestantism and Catholicism. They disagree about some very important things, such as the authority of the Church and Christ's real presence in the Eucharist, but they agree about even more important things, about the reality of God and the divinity of Christ. The difference between them is relatively small compared to the difference between either of them and atheism. Similarly, the difference between Plato and Aristotle is small compared with the difference between either of them and the typically modern mind. Aristotle is Plato tweaked. For Aristotle, matter and form are not beings, but principles of a being, aspects of a being. Aristotle's name for concrete individual beings or entities is substances, as that which stands under, substans, accidents or qualities, to unify them. The same person is happy one moment and sad the next. The same leaf is green in September and yellow in October. This distinction between the substance or essence and the accidents or the changeable properties or characteristics is one of the most important and essential philosophical distinctions in common sense sanity, which is increasingly uncommon today. I think it is significant that the only two essential Catholic dogmas that depend on secular philosophical categories and are framed by them, in fact, the two most essential ones of all, concerning the very center of the Catholic religion, Christ himself, are the two that depend on this Aristotelian category of substance. First, that Christ is consubstantial with God the Father, homoousion in Greek, the same in being, essence, essential nature, or substance. And second, that in the Eucharist, it is the very substance that changes from bread and wine to Christ's body and blood, transubstantiation. Another example of one of the most
you can stop it
practical
there.
and useful theories.
Perfect.
So this is from a series of 12 lectures from Word on Fire, which is Cardinal Robert Barron's organization, I believe. And this is Peter Kraft, I think. And it's an excellent lecture series. It's pretty surface level, but even still, in about 30 to 35-minute lectures, you get about 24 major philosophical thinkers. He goes through each one contrasting two different philosophers in each lecture. So we'll do like the Sophists versus Socrates. He'll do in this one Aristotle versus Kant, and so he'll often take one more modern or one more ancient, or he'll take two from around the same time period. But the basically just talking about the philosophical conversation as it's progressed throughout time. So very good series. But in this point, in this part of this particular lecture, he's making the point that transubstantiation, that specific phraseology, does require a Hellenistic underpinning. That's why we use transubstantiation rather than real spiritual presence, right? Real spiritual presence makes a lot more sense just going from the biblical data, right? That's why Calvin used that sort of terminology. But transubstantiation works and means something pretty similar, but it works within the context of this Aristotelian thinking, when Aristotle inherited a lot of the same vocabulary from Plato as well. So just this overall Hellenistic vocabulary that was being used to good effect by the early church. I mean, a lot of our language does inherit a lot of good, sound vocabulary, if nothing else. I mean, they were using these Greek terms to describe things that they really didn't have terms for, and this is what they were grasping onto. But the dogmatic holding to transubstantiation specifically as the formula that we must use when talking about the Eucharist is that's one that I think can and should be called into question by anyone who holds Scripture to a much higher standard than Hellenistic philosophy, as I think we all should. The only reason why Catholics do hold these things dogmatically is because they're proclaimed to be true by the Church. So they even hold, they hold Scripture and the Church's authority over Hellenistic philosophy. But the way the Church has talked about things has been through this lens of Hellenistic philosophy. And so in many ways, Hellenistic philosophy has been elevated to a level of infallibility that maybe should be questioned in some regards. But again, I'm not convinced that real spiritual presence is actually all that different in terms of this particular question of in what ways are the bread and wine the body and blood of Christ. In that particular question, I'm not sure that real spiritual presence and transubstantiation are actually all of that different positions. I think that's mainly a semantical debate. It's mainly just different words describing something that's pretty similar. There are other differences that are more interesting that we should talk about. But the point I just made is something that I think basically very few Protestants, even that have heard about the debate between Protestants and Catholics on this point, that they really realize how close all of the different high views of the Lord's Supper are.
Yeah, it does come down to philosophy and interpretation at that point, especially when the accidents and substance distinction is is interesting, right? Because you are saying that in the Catholic theology that the accidents don't change, but then the substance, what it actually is changed, even though the taste, the texture, the size, the look of it is all the same, right?
Yeah, which sounds like a spiritual change to me. All right, so yeah, this was a slide I was trying to show, and it was showing up on my end, nicely presenting one at a time. But sorry that wasn't showing up for you guys. Go back one. There was a couple more points at the bottom of that slide. Yeah, there you go, slide 2. So just to map some of the common terms. So yeah, spiritual presence versus real presence. I think we've talked about that. I think that it just comes down to what you mean by real, and so I think that. And what you mean by literal, and so it's really hard to make that distinction, and I'm certainly not able to right now with common vocabulary. There are distinctions that you can make, but they really start to get into the weeds. In terms of transubstantiation versus consubstantiation, so that's the Catholic view versus the Lutheran view, because Luther was really hard on this. I mean, he thought Zwingli's perspective was just downright heretical, and basically he condemned it so much that he thought that the Zwingli was not a Christian.
Well, that was the split right away, basically.
Yeah,
they agreed on literally everything except for that. Yeah.
Yep. So it was big to Luther, but consubstantiation essentially the big difference between that and transubstantiation is that the substance of the bread and the wine still remain. And that's the big difference. Catholics would say that it changes from bread and wine to now having the substance of the body and blood of Christ. Whereas with Luther, he would say, yes, it does add the body and blood of Christ, but it keeps the bread and the wine. The bread and the wine substances are still there, just like the accidents are still there. But also now you have the body and blood of Christ, which is a much more incarnational view, right? That would be very much like the act of the incarnation where Christ takes on human form, whereas the Catholic view is really the transubstantiation is not an act of incarnation. It's related, but it's not, because the substance has changed, but the accents don't change, which is very different from the kenosis, the act of Christ taking on the limitations of manhood. So I'm not even sure that Luther would say that the Eucharist is really a purely incarnational act, but I think that view, the consubstantiation view, is much closer to the incarnation. And then so then we talked about substance versus accidents. So yeah, that's everything from this slide.
Yeah, and I mean, this honestly wouldn't probably be as big of a deal if in the Council of Trent the Catholic Church hadn't anathematized everyone who didn't take the transubstantiation. So that's when it was dogmatized, which was...
It was actually dogmatized prior to that in the 1200s.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have it right here. Where is it?
By the way, it wasn't anathematized until the Council of Trent.
Yeah.
And so, which was probably in response to the Reformation.
Yeah. So yeah, it was dogmatized at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215.
1215. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. Yeah, the Orthodox don't engage in this debate in the same
Correct.
way.
Well, and so that is actually something that I like a lot more about them, is because
yeah.
they allow for it to be a mystical, mysterious work of God, right? And the exact mechanics are not of interest.
Which is the point I'm trying to make, is that
we should
all at least agree on that. Yeah.
I think that's a way simpler way to think about it, whether, because you don't have to bind yourself to Aristotelian ontology of things, right? You don't have to bind yourself to Greek philosophy to believe in a real presence. How is it real? Not sure, and it's not really up for us to understand the workings of God in this way. And again, the issue with the Catholics is that they anathematize everybody who had any disagreement on just the foundational philosophy. Yeah.
But one thing that I think is important to note between points 2 and 4 here is all of those views, especially the well, yeah, basically anything after the first one, all recognize the importance of the ritual aspect of the Lord's Supper. That we do this, physically, that we actually eat the bread and wine, and I think that is key. And to go beyond that, I think it is good to have a high view of the Lord's Supper where you actually see it as being. There is something that is taking place. There is some real power that is happening. I mean, even Calvin basically saw this as. I mean, they were very careful about fencing the bread and the wine from people that shouldn't be participating in it. And that's another term that it's on the next slide. But basically, fencing the table is what they call it, where you basically prevent people because Christ says, or Paul says, that if you eat and drink when you shouldn't, then you can bring down judgment upon yourself, as opposed to bringing down the benefits.
In Paul's view, he says like people have died because of taking it improperly, right? So whether that's people might argue that they were implemented improperly or having a non-contrite spirit when taking it, or like the actual ritual itself was done improperly, whether the priest or the bishop or whoever it was not performing the ritual as it's supposed to, basically. Yeah, there can be lots of errors with it.
All right, so just a couple of the terms. So the first one here, sacrifice. This is a much bigger difference. I think one of the biggest differences between the Catholic and the Protestant view. And I'm actually curious what the Orthodox perspective is on this. So please let me know in the chat. But
it's eternal sacrifice.
Eternal sacrifice. Okay.
Eternal sacrifice.
So the Protestant view is that when it says that Christ died once for all, we do not need to reenact that every single week in the Mass. That is not an additional sacrifice. It's like it happened once. We are doing this in remembrance of him. That doesn't take away from the power. Doesn't take away from the realness of it, but it's not a repeated sacrifice, whereas the Catholic view is that there is an actual sacrifice taking place. And sacrifice, there's a way to technically define it, and includes, I think there's like 4 different parts, and I think we could probably even agree on a number of the different elements of what comprises a sacrifice, but ultimately, Protestants do not view the Lord's Supper as being sacrifice, because we feel like that would go against Paul describing this as Christ dying once for all, and so that, I think, is a much bigger difference. Although even there, you start to get into some semantic differences where Protestants see it. This is the second bullet point here. Protestants see it as being a representation of the sacrifice. So regardless of what you think about the real presence, Protestants see this as being a representation of the sacrifice, whereas Catholics see it as being a re-presentation of the sacrifice, like a reenactment of the sacrifice. They still hold to Christ dying once for all, but somehow he's dying again every single time. And then I think Orthodox, would see it as an eternal sacrifice. I don't know if there's a difference between the Orthodox and the Catholic view.
As far as I understand, which is actually in the clip that I pulled today for the Orthodox argument for it, is a infinite payment model. So essentially, Christ is infinitely good, our sins are infinitely bad, and so it is the infinite sacrifice. Christ is our perpetual sacrifice for our sins to God, basically. If I quoted that correctly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious if there is a distinction between that view and the Catholic view.
There probably is, but it's even more nuanced than the real versus spiritual presence. So
yeah, well, and Orthodox are generally a lot more comfortable with just accepting the mystery, which is good to a point. There are some things that perhaps shouldn't be as mysterious, but it all just depends on where Scripture allows us to go. And I think that Yeah, there are many places that are just not left open to much deeper penetration. And then, so Paedo communion, just to finish off this list here, Paedo communion is still practiced, I believe, by Orthodox. I don't know if there's any Catholics that practice this. Maybe in the Byzantine churches, I'm not sure, but some Orthodox, if not all, do practice Paedo communion. Some Presbyterians practice Paedo communion as well. It's rather rare, but you'll see it like Doug Wilson, who we talked about last stream. I believe their church does do Paedo communion, but basically that's giving the bread and wine to infants, or at least the bread. I don't know if they do both, but that is seen as a furthering of sort of this covenant theology of, if we're treating them as members of the church, then we should also give them all of the benefits of members of the church. Whereas the traditional perspective is that there is a difference between someone who is a covenant member of the church and someone who is a communing member of the church, meaning taking the Lord's Supper. And the reason for that distinction is the explicit discussion of fencing the table, where it's clear that there is a certain amount of rational assent and thinking that's important to taking the Lord's Supper correctly, and therefore it seems like there is explicit biblical data to restrict communion from certain individuals, even if you accept their membership in the church. And so that goes back to the conversation we had on baptism, where the Credo or Paedo Baptists view baptism as being the next iteration. It has a lot of continuity with circumcision, and we only draw discontinuity where Scripture explicitly gives us that discontinuity. So, for instance, the process of circumcision is very different from the process of baptism, and so, but that's called out very clearly in Scripture. Well, here again, if we didn't have it explicitly said, don't give communion to people that shouldn't be taking it, then we would give communion to everyone. We certainly would give it to all members, including infants. But because it says that there's a certain amount of rational forethought required to taking communion properly, then we restrict that from people that have not made a public profession of faith. And I think that's the same. It's generally shared amongst Presbyterian and Catholic circles. Chris, do you know if there are any Paedo communion groups within Catholicism writ large?
Not that I'm aware of. No, Paedo communion is not practiced whatsoever. You got to go through the sacraments before you receive your first communion.
So then, frequency. Again, we're just sort of going through some key concepts around communion just to give a survey. There are a number of different views on how often you should partake. And historically, it was given about once a year by the Catholic Church. That was the expectation, and it was usually only the bread. That's the last point here, the communion under both kinds or both species.
Well, yeah, so I actually pulled some stuff up on that. So it was it was argued by Aquinas. I want to say, I think I have it here. So, Thomas Aquinas spoke of it as a practice already prevalent in this time, being only the bread, and he recommended it as a way of avoiding irreverence and spilling. Alexander Hales, who died in 1245, said that it was only permissible for lay people to receive the Eucharist under the species of bread, as was done almost everywhere in his day. Now, that to me seems strange, to say that lay people can only have the bread. And again, this is in 1245. Now, in the Council of Constance in 1415, they banned both forms of communion. And there's another type of communion where, because people essentially, they didn't want to just share from one chalice, but they were not allowed to use multiple chalices. They could only use one, because that Jesus only consecrated one chalice, right? So they weren't allowed to use 2 or 3 or 4 or more, just one. In the East, they had a practice of taking the communion and dipping it in the wine, right? Mm-hmm. But then that was banned as well in some places. And then in Vatican II specifically, they allow it under both species in some places where the law permits, is kind of how it's phrased. So there was this kind of strange gap where early on in the church, you would have both. In the Middle Ages, things get a little fuzzy depending on where you are. And then Vatican II, they're like, you can have both depending on where you are. So it's still really dependent, I guess, on where you are.
And do you know why they wanted to just do one? Why they would restrict it?
Well, so according to them, is Christ's body only in the consecrated host? Is the wine, consecrated wine, only his blood? So no. So according to St. Pius X, both under the species of the bread and under the species of the wine, the living Jesus Christ is all present with his body, his blood, his soul, and his divinity, both in the host and in the chalice. Jesus Christ is whole and entire because he is living and immortal in the Eucharist, as he is in heaven. Hence, where his body is, there also are his blood, soul, and divinity. And where his blood is, there are also his body, soul, and his divinity, all these being inseparable in Jesus Christ. So their idea behind it is that the wine is simply not necessary.
Well, that's the justification for why it was okay, but there is a further justification for why it was good to restrict the wine from the lay people.
I'm not sure of this gentleman that I quoted earlier, because Thomas Aquinas didn't like the wine because he didn't like it for practical purposes, for possible irreverence or spilling or whatever it might be. And then I'm not sure why this guy, Alexander of Hales in 1245, said that it was only permissible for lay people to have the bread. Now, it could be just that when Christ shared the wine, it was only with his apostles, right? So they're, bishops at the time, right? So not lay people by any stretch of the means. So, I mean, you might be able to draw a distinction there. Maybe in the early church, bread was the normal means, and then they saved the wine for priests or higher class. I'm not exactly sure what his reasoning for that is, but the point being that there has been different views of what species are permissible for what people at different times in the Catholic Church, which to me seems strange because where we get the whole thing from is Christ giving both the bread and the wine. Both. So, again, from a Protestant perspective, I have never seen a communion service not have, bread and wine. And I say quotation marks because it's bread and wine. It doesn't always mean bread and wine in Protestant circles.
Yeah. I think it directly derives from the idea of transubstantiation, and when you consider that the body does include blood, then it works out. But if you are just simply looking at the biblical data and looking at the way that Christ instituted the sacrament, then from a Protestant perspective, it feels wrong to do it differently, just on a philosophical technicality, right? Because that is what it is. It's a technicality that works on the basis of Hellenistic presuppositions, which might be valid, but it's really impossible to say biblically whether they are or not. Yep.
All right, let me pull your thing back up. All right. And next slide.
Go back real quick. Let me see if there's anything else. So taking together communion versus private masses, that was a big thing in the Reformation. Was a lot of the reformers wanted to. I think the Westminster Confession officially condemns all private masses. So Presbyterians and most Protestants in general only take communion as a group in communion with other believers. And I think a lot of that was. I think a lot of that was just practical. I think there are some spiritual reasons, but I think it was a reaction to the private masses that would be offered to richer people, to lords and priests, and I think it was just seen as a way of basically dividing the body unnecessarily. And we see this as a communal dinner and or a communal activity. So that is a key distinction that you will see. I'm not as familiar with the exact justifications for one versus the other, or why that was such a big deal, but I know that was a thing coming out of the Reformation, eliminating private masses.
Now, what about this idea that in Catholicism, It has to be from a priest consecrated, and at the moment of consecration is when the transubstantiation happens.
Yes.
But I've also heard stories of like people. This is obviously very, very special circumstances, so this is like a one-off, where like people in concentration camps or POWs or whatnot, there are no ordained priests, but they still seek to take communion as a body of believers or whatnot. So they take whatever they can, whether it's fermented juice or just generic bread, and they kind of perform their own communion in these very isolated special circumstances where they don't have an ordained priest there. They don't have the real elements, so to speak, or the proper elements as they would be in like a regular mass. Do those still have some sort of validity? And I imagine if there was an exception, it would be for those sort of cases.
I'd have to look into it and do some more research, but...
oh, sorry. I think I lost your guys' audio, so I will be right back.
Okay, no worries.
Keep going, Christian.
So I was actually looking into this about confession, which kind of correlates. So you are encouraged to go to confession and confess to a priest as soon as you can, but if you're not able to, I believe through Catholic doctrine, you can confess your sins directly to Christ. But you are encouraged to go through the proper sacrament in order to do it. So if the circumstances cause you to perform the sacrament a little bit in unorthodox way or without the church, then I think it would be deemed okay. But I would have to do some more research into that doctrinal wise.
That
but
seems
I would
to hold
assume
with what I've read in other cases with other sacraments as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would assume
baptism.
if that's the way it is for confession, which is pretty on par with communion, I would assume it's very similar.
Makes sense. You can go to the next slide. Oh, there is one thing about the frequency I want to talk about. You can stay on this slide, that's fine. But the frequency discussion has, so some, you had just once a year. Then at the time of the Reformation, a lot of Protestants would do it more often than once a year. They wanted to emphasize it. But some saw that there were a lot of different views on how often you should take communion. And even prior to the Reformation, you would have a lot of variations where sort of the upper classes and the priesthood, they would take it much more regularly, sometimes every single day, sometimes once a week. And so you'd have a lot of variations. There's a particular story that I think is very interesting because it goes back to the Church of Geneva. So for anyone who is a Calvinist or has a great respect for Calvin and his work in Geneva, you have a very interesting case study in frequency of taking the Lord's Supper in this one Church of Geneva. So when they first embraced the Reformation, they were doing communion once a quarter. And I think that was an improvement over the once a year. When Calvin came in to help with the Reformation, he and his colleague Farel, I think William Farel, wanted to do it every week. And this is one of the things that they were butting heads with some of the leaders at Geneva over, was the frequency of taking the Lord's Supper. And Calvin and Farel were both kicked out of town for probably good reasons. They were they were being a little bit too strict and basically excommunicating people for reasons that were probably unjust. So they needed a little bit of humility. So they were kicked out of town because of just strife. And then eventually Calvin was invited back. And when he came back, they were still doing it once a quarter, still doing communion once a quarter. And rather than pushing for once a week, he compromised to once a month. And what I love is that right there in the Church of Geneva, you will see, which is John Calvin's church, you will see all three common Protestant forms of communion, the once a quarter, once a month, and once a week, all present as examples in terms of the actual practice and the preferences. So it really is, even in traditional Calvinist Protestant circles, there is a lot of latitude there. I do think that once a quarter is too infrequent. I like the idea of once a week, but I actually think that once a month does seem to make it a little bit more special. It tends to set it apart from other Sunday services, which is something that I personally appreciate, just in terms of making, sort of allowing a certain build up. But the current church I go to does it every single week, so I'm not sure that needs to be much dogma around that. But I do love that you see all the three most common Protestant forms of frequency right there in the Church of Geneva.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Catholic Mass, you have Eucharistic adoration every week.
Yes.
But not
yes, there's Eucharistic
participation.
adoration. No. So it's not done at Mass. It's done off schedule of Mass. And yeah, it's just a consecrated host is brought out in a, what is it called? Oh, I just looked it up too, and I already forgot what it's called. But anyway, it's like the gold-plated or silver-plated glass thing that the host
chalice,
is held in. Yeah, and that's placed on the altar, and then you just pretty much it's like very similar to venerating Mary.
So this slide and some of the next slides are getting more into the philosophical discussion, and I think you guys probably need a break from hearing me talk about that. So maybe we should do another clip before we get to that.
Well, I kind of had, so I wanted to talk about Eucharistic miracles, and because I know, Christian, you brought some of those up.
I did, yeah.
Which is fun. And then I have a J. Dyer counter clip specifically to the Eucharistic miracles, which, again, my position isn't either of those things, so I just thought it would be fun to kind of talk about those back and forth.
No, absolutely.
This is the first one that you had. Is there a timestamp for this one?
No, I didn't really timestamp it, but...
Okay, just the whole thing?
Sure.
Yeah, well, and just let me know when to stop it, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Mass, when the priest utters the words of consecration, sometimes God makes it visible. This was Archbishop Bergoglio. Who was he? Pope Francis. Now, in a small church, which I went to visit, I wanted to learn everything I could about this. The priest was told that a consecrated host had been desecrated and was on a small candle holder in the back of the church. The priest could not consume it. That's pretty sad. That means there was something on it like feces. And he could not consume the host. It was desecrated. So they put it into a glass of water. See? The glass of water. And they put it back into the tabernacle. When a host can't be consumed, what's the proper way to dispose of it?
Burn it, right?
You place it in water. It dissolves, and you either pour it into the ground, onto the ground, or into a sacrarium. Sacrarium. Not an aquarium.
Pause it.
Now,
So a sacrarium is essentially a special sink that you pour the consecrated host down once it dissolves in holy water, and the drain leads straight into the earth as opposed to the sewer. So it's a more respectful way, I don't want to say to dispose of, but a more respectful way to dispose of a consecrated host that's been desecrated. But yeah, go ahead.
put this host in the water for it to dissolve. But here's what happened. What should have taken just a couple days to dissolve didn't. When the priest came back and opened up the tabernacle doors 8 days later, the host that he saw had been transformed. It was now a piece of bloody tissue, which was much larger than the original host. And so the priest decided to keep the host in the tabernacle, not publicizing it or its origin, a very humble man. And I met him. And he didn't want any media coverage. He didn't want any news. And so he left it in there. Take a guess how long he left it in there. 3 years. And it never decomposed. This bloody tissue remained. Bread can't last 3 years in water. And so the bloody tissue never decomposed. No special attempt was made to save it. This had not decomposed. This is extraordinary. It's virtually impossible to explain, especially because no attempt was made to preserve it. It wasn't sealed. It wasn't put in some hermeneutic container. So all of a sudden, one of the good friends of our Marian Fathers community got wind of this. And here he is at the National Shrine of the Divine Mercy. This is Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez. He lives in Bolivia. And he got wind of this. He is a neurological surgeon or a neurosurgeon and a cardiologist, a heart doctor. And he got wind of this, and he went and he got the bloody tissue. So he took a sample of the bloody tissue fragment and he sent it to New York City. Now, since he did not want any prejudice of the scientific community, because if they found out this was a Catholic host from a mass, it would have been dismissed. And he knew that they would examine it in New York, the tissue, and he did not want to reveal its source. So he sent the subject, or the top of the matter, to New York, and a team of 5 scientists was assembled, including the famous cardiologist and forensic pathologist, Dr. Frederick Zugby. He's the author of many books on forensic pathology, and he testified. I got majorly involved in this case. And so Dr. Frederick Zugby testified that the material is a fragment of human heart muscle found in the wall of the left ventricle of the heart. The muscle, this muscle, is responsible for the contraction of the heart. The left cardiac ventricle pumps blood to all parts of the body. It keeps the body alive. But, he said, this heart tissue is in an inflammatory condition and contains many white blood cells. This indicates that the heart was alive at the time the sample was taken. They said, we have a murder. We have a murder.
I think you can cut it there. I think we got the gist. I want your guys' takes.
Well, so I don't deny Eucharistic miracles or miracles in general. I think that's a bad position to take, an anti-stance on this sort of thing. Personally, however, I do think that you need to be very careful when accepting miracles or basing your theology upon them. In Galatians, it's very clear this is a sinful generation that will look for signs and miracles and follow those rather than the words that I've given you, right? So I want to be very careful, because the counterpoint to this, which isn't a counterpoint to this, so I wouldn't deny this specific example at all. Like I don't think this is out of the realm of possibility whatsoever for God to transform a Eucharist into like his real physical, like actually like heart tissue, like his own heart tissue in that sort of sense. Like I don't believe that's out of the realm of possibility whatsoever. But I could also point to like at a Coptic church, a Marian apparition, right? And you have like hundreds of witnesses say that this happened. But I wouldn't convert to a Coptic Christianity, if you want to even call it Christianity, just because of some Marian apparition or supernatural miracle, right? So it's very cool, but you also want to be very careful. So that's my... I don't know if James has a take on it as well.
My take is pretty similar. I think that... I think there's a couple things. I mean, one, yes, absolutely, the supernatural is possible, and so God absolutely could do this. I think there are a number of issues in terms of verifying these as being truly miraculous. I think there are all kinds of holes you could poke in the stories. Even this one. I mean, there's just chain of custody issues. There's all kinds of things that you could poke in it. But I'm not sure that that's necessary. I think that it is. To your point, John, I think it is dangerous to be too emphatic on this is definitely nothing supernatural. It's like, well, God can do things, and he absolutely, I think he does work in miraculous ways, even, in this stage of after his, revelation is, the canon may be closed, and I think that is something that Catholics and Protestants tend to agree on, although I'm not sure exactly where Catholics fall, but certainly the Presbyterian view is that the canon in terms of Christ's, well, I guess this probably isn't actually something we agree on, but the Presbyterian view is that the canon in terms of the reliable, infallible revelation is closed. We're not going to get any new revelation, special revelation from God that we can rely on in the same way that we do rely on Scripture. But that's not to say that God does not work miracles or still even reveal himself in special ways to Christians. Some Protestants would go as far as saying that God basically doesn't provide any new special revelation. But I certainly wouldn't say that. I think that God absolutely can speak. So like some people would say that the age of prophets, like what Paul talks about in Corinthians, I believe, in terms of some of the gifts, that was just sort of a first century thing, and that basically died away with the apostolic age. I don't see a need for that. I think that you can still have people receiving special revelation, but the rest of the church's responsibility or requirement to accept that as being some kind of infallible and reliable revelation is closed. That we no longer have a way to fully verify that kind of thing. And so typically the way I see those acts of special revelation, if they occur, and miracles like this, are in a primarily confirming work. It's God using miraculous means to confirm his truths to his people. And I think God can do that in all kinds of ways that may or may not match a particular theological perspective. And so I see, I don't see Eucharistic miracles as being a problem for Protestants, because it's not like Catholics believe that it actually transforms in terms of the accidents into the body and blood of Christ. And so this is clearly something extraordinary that's happening even in the Catholic system. And in the Protestant system, this would be something that's very extraordinary, perhaps to emphasize the real presence. But again, what does real even mean here? But so this is equally extraordinary in both systems. And so I don't see this as being a problem in terms of Protestant theology. The bigger question would be some of the miracles around, like the Marian dogmas, where you have Marian apparitions, but even those, I don't feel the need to necessarily refute. I mean, some of them are very suspect, and I think we should be skeptical, to your point, John. But I don't see the need to necessarily reject all of them, because I think God does reveal himself in certain ways to individual people to confirm their faith as they need it confirmed. And so yes, the Marian apparitions do seem to, like there's one, I think, where Mary appears to someone and specifically refers to herself as being immaculately conceived or something along those lines. And that's supposed to be even part of the proof that it's a miracle, is because that person would have never, who's too young to have ever heard that term, immaculate conception, something along those lines. And I am certainly skeptical of those, but even if that truly did happen in a miraculous fashion, that doesn't tell me that I now have to believe in the immaculate conception in a Catholic or even Orthodox way. So yeah, I guess that's how I see it.
Okay. Right, and so like there's other cool things too. Like you can point to the Shroud of Turin, right, and other things that are like, these are really cool, really, really cool. However, I would be hesitant to base my faith upon some of these, right? Because, like, let's say it's like I see the Shroud of Turin, I'm not a Christian, and that's what converts me, right? It's that realness of it. And then, like, a year later, it comes out that, oh, well, actually, we figured out how it was made, and it's not. It's like, well, that thing, that miracle that I just put my faith on, rather than the Word of God, rather than His church, whatever you want to say about it, well, that just got taken away. Right, so while I think that these things can be very cool and very helpful, I don't think that miracles can be the foundation for your faith. Now, some people experience miracles like personally, like you can talk about like Wes Huff or something like that, where they experience like a unexplainable medical phenomenon where they were, either going to die or had some sort of condition that was never going to be healed, becomes healed, documented by doctors, whatever you want to call it, and they have that personal experience, and that is the foundation of their faith, right? But I think it's very cool. I don't want to downplay it, but at the same time, I don't think these are the cornerstone of like all of our faiths, right?
Sure.
I think that's kind of a misappropriation of it.
But I guess one could argue that Jesus even got a lot of people to follow him through miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that was a tool of him for sure. Yeah. And so that's why I would be very careful to not downplay it. But also, again, in Galatians, Paul explicitly warns them not to follow like miracles because, demons can interact with the physical world as well. So you got to be very careful about it, right?
And Jesus' miracles were always secondary to his message, right?
Yes.
Jesus, it's pretty clear that when he would heal the sick, he was ultimately concerned with the forgiveness of sins, with the salvation of their souls. And he would heal to show that he had the power to forgive sins. And so it was a confirming work, even in the work of Christ.
No, absolutely. 100% agree with you. But no, I just thought it was kind of cool. And I mean, there's an entire website dedicated to Eucharistic miracles. And this guy's actually going to be canonized as a saint, I believe, September 7th of this year. And he died of, his name is Carlos Actuis, if I...
Okay, the creator of the exhibition.
Yeah,
okay.
and he died at 15 of leukemia.
Oh, that's very sad.
Wow.
Tragic.
Yeah.
So speaking of Eucharist, the word Eucharist, does anyone know what the etymology of Eucharist is?
Assuming you do.
So, yeah,
Well, Eucharist
I would have...
Go ahead.
I would have thought that it was true Christ if I was just thinking from the roots, but it actually has nothing to do with the word for Christ, and even the "you" part of it doesn't really mean true in this instance. It's actually charis, which is grace, and the "you" is more like well, and so it's more like well-wishing or wishing grace on someone or thanksgiving, and so. Eucharistia, I believe, is one of the roots of it, and it's basically just graceful or thanksgiving is what it initially came. I think Eucharistos is thanksgiving, and so it's basically to give thanks is what Eucharist is derived from. So that was interesting. So I think it goes more towards the breaking of the bread and the giving thanks.
And this was sort of in that vein of why it's dangerous to base your entire faith upon miracles. Not that they're a bad part of your faith, but just to base your entire faith. This is a dialogue between Jay Dyer and a Catholic on some of the miracles.
Unmute.
Hello?
Yep.
Hey, I've been on before, but last time I was on, this was I guess a few weeks ago.
Yeah, the cops are after you still, dude.
I got interrupted by the police last time. So, I was talking last time about exorcisms in Catholicism. And I guess you brought up Deuteronomy and how there's kind of like, basically miracles aren't sufficient to validate.
Yeah, let me give an example. So I just read the Rosicrucian chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Western Mysticism and Esotericism, and the founder of Rosicrucianism claimed to be an incorruptible. So should I be a Rosicrucian?
The founder claimed to. No, I don't think. Well, I think the argument I was making took a little bit more development, and to be fair, I didn't articulate it very well, and I guess I should probably formalize this and lay it out as premises to make it easier.
So wait, Sai Baba claimed to have a lot of miracles. Should I be a Hindu?
Well, it depends on the miracle.
So we just tack on more and more arbitrary. So how do we know that that's the thing that proves it?
Well, I think there's some miracles that are kind of like magic tricks, and there's other.
Okay. You don't see how silly this is?
I don't think it is silly.
Right. I'm sure you don't. Yeah.
Because I think someone being freed from demonic oppression is intrinsically good.
You're missing the point, though, because while it's true that somebody being freed from that oppression is good, me hearing a bunch of different claims does in no way tell me which one's the right one.
Right, but I just in the instance in Deuteronomy, though, for example, that's an instance where the prophecy actually does come to pass, but because they lead them after other gods, they're still a false prophet, right?
Right.
So in that case, I'm just saying that that's an example of something that might appear miraculous that maybe isn't sufficient, and I think there's other miracles.
So do you understand that you're basically just, every time there's a problem for that position, you're just qualifying it, saying that miracle doesn't count, or that sign or omen doesn't count, and you arbitrarily said, but this specific type of exorcism miracle is the one that proves it. That's all arbitrary, bro. Why?
I guess the way I came to this conclusion, this is actually how I became Catholic, not how I try to justify it looking back. And the reason it persuaded me anyway is because
Jay does this where he gets incredibly tired of people talking to him in like 2 minutes, but he streams for 3 or 4 hours only talking to other people. So this is the way most of his clips end up.
For me,
The bad arguments persuaded you, correct?
Well, no one argued this. It was just me reading the Gospels. It convicted me because I didn't. It seemed that Jesus believed that was very strong evidence and condemned the Pharisees for rejecting it.
But you're missing the point, though. The miracles attend to the true faith, but how do they necessarily prove the true faith when we're all in a position of hearing countless different miracle claims? You don't.
So, can I ask you why would it have been wrong for the Pharisees to use your argument from Deuteronomy to reject Jesus since he claimed to be God?
Because that's why Jesus goes to great lengths to prove that he's not in contrast to anything in the Torah.
I don't.
You understand? Look, when Jesus, with the guy who's in Abraham's bosom, Jesus says, even if one rises from the dead, they won't believe. This refutes you. The very thing you claim, even more powerful than an exorcism, would be a resurrection. And Jesus says, even with a resurrection, they're not going to believe. Why? Because they have Moses and the prophets. And if they won't hear Moses and the prophets, they're not going to believe though one rise from the dead. That refutes your whole position. Now hold on. So in regard to Jesus' attitude to the Old Testament, he doesn't just do a miracle to say that, look, who cares about the Old Testament? Here's a bunch of miracles and signs and wonders. In fact, he actually criticizes everybody asking for miracles and signs and wonders because he says a faithless generation seeks signs and wonders. And he says the only thing that will be given to it is the sign of Jonah. Rather, he argues constantly that he is the fulfillment of the text, the prophecies. So he puts text and prophecy first and miracles second. You and all the other Roman Catholics put miracles first, and you miss the whole fallacy of why this doesn't work. And I asked you, I think last time, if the Coptics have Mary appear to thousands of people, why does that not prove Coptic theology?
Well, I just want to. I'll concede very quickly that.
He gets so paid so fast. It's entertainment.
Why
I don't
does he
know.
do this
People
to
just.
himself?
Yeah. Well, but I think he cuts right to the chase. Basically, it's like miracles can be good, great, fantastic. We don't even deny miracles. We don't say that they don't happen, even if they happen outside of what you claim to be the one true church, because you have the example where Jesus tells his apostles, like, we see other people doing miracles. If they're not against us, then they're for us, that sort of thing. But you can't just base everything on miracles, because then, some crazy Hindu guy is going to say, well, look, I've healed 1,000 people in a night. Believe me, I guess. Right? And even if you have like some really good evidence for some of these miracles, if they are pushing you away from the Word of God or the one true church or whatever it might be in your specific paradigm, I would be very wary of them. So, which is why when I look at like Catholic miracles or Orthodox miracles or really any miracle, I think great, awesome, but also I have that. I don't want that to be my cornerstone. Is basing everything off the miracles.
No, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys want to go through the rest of this clip. It is very entertaining, but if you guys want to move on to something else, James, if you want to get back to philosophy and etymology, we can go back if you'd like.
Hey, if this is entertaining, I'm good with it. The only thing I would add is that I disagree somewhat with Jay's take that this person is convinced by unreliable arguments or bad evidence. I mean, because I think that we need to separate the psychology of conversion from the justification for it. I think that very often certain things convince us that won't necessarily convince other people, but that doesn't make it an illegitimate belief, because ultimately all knowledge, period, and I can prove this. I hope to at some point show this pretty clearly. This is an argument that I've spent a lot of time formulating. All knowledge ultimately rests on faith, and the question really is what is the basis for your faith? What is the inductive reasoning for your faith? And miracles can absolutely be a part of the induction that leads us to accept certain presuppositions on faith that then lead us to other conclusions. And so, yes, miracles do not prove anything deductively, but they can be a part of the overall inductive evidence that leads us to adopt a certain set of presuppositions. And there's nothing invalid about that. So a particular miracle being particularly convincing to someone, being something that really affected them in their own personal reasoning, is not invalid, as long as they're not relying on that as sort of some sort of syllogistic, this happened, therefore I must believe this. That does have issues. But if you're just simply saying that this is one piece of evidence that confirms this particular presupposition, and then from that presupposition I draw these conclusions, that's really the only way to validly think. And I think that miracles can be a part of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge emphasis on like personal miracles or things that happen. I'm not muted, am I? Okay, perfect. I was on the wrong screen. Yeah, but like again, people who like have cancer and have it cured, like just goes away one day, right? Like a huge effect on them personally. But can that be the foundation of everybody's belief? No, of course not.
Asian Massage Review says, incorrect. My knowledge rests on observation and experience. But this is the point. In the end, your observation and experience still have to be filtered through this process of faith. This is the induction. The inductions are abstracted from your observations and your experience, but you have to take on faith a lot of presuppositions that you can even rely on your observation and experience. I mean, how do you know that you're not just dreaming all of these things? How do you know that when you dream, that's not the real world, and this world that you're living is actually the dream? You take that on faith. Now, you have good reason to believe that, right? I mean, for one thing, just the sheer percentage of the time you spend in this world versus the dreaming world, and the constant changes in the dreaming world. There's all kinds of reasons why you can believe that this is the real world and that's the fake world. But ultimately, you can't prove that. You can't prove that, it's the Descartes idea of maybe we're just all being tormented by a demon in our head that presents the world as we see it to us. And we all have our own little demon. I mean, it's basically the simulation or the matrix. There's no way to conclusively prove that any of the things aren't true. They might seem preposterous to you, and there's all kinds of reasons to believe that they aren't true. I certainly don't think that we're living in a simulation, but you can't prove that. You have to just take on faith that your observations and your experiences are even valid. And in many cases, they're not valid. And that's another thing that you have to abstract from the bad observations, the times when you thought you saw something, but you actually saw something different. How do you deal with that? And you have to deal with that through by reconciling that with other observations and other experiences, and you start to abstract the more fundamental truths, and eventually the most reliable truths are the presuppositions that you hold at the very base level, your first principles, the postulates of your logical system, and then from there you can build syllogistically, you can build logically, deductively upon those. And so no one can escape this process, and everyone ultimately has to rely on certain presuppositions, and presuppositions by definition have to be accepted by faith.
Well, yeah, observation and experience are pretty meaningless, considering that experience is based off of your memory, and memory is not a particularly useful or authentic terms of anything. And yeah, sometimes your observations are also just wrong. So it's like I don't know how you could base your worldview off of that and be like, I only sense data. It's like, oh, is your sense data always correct? No. Well, there's your worldview gone. Congratulations. Chase faces me right now. We all have those moments. That
doesn't, because there's something else I wanted to say. One of the fulfillments that Jesus brings is the miracles that he does.
We already dealt with this. Did you not hear what I said? Oh my gosh.
But Jesus predicts that his followers will do the very same things that he did.
Okay, again, none of that proves your position. Again, miracles attend to true faith, and there are signs of it, but they cannot be the thing itself that proves it.
I mean, I would say that it's an indication that your biblical objections to Catholicism or other maybe you should reconsider them.
No, that's just another dumb representation of your position. That's an even dumber argument of restatement of your position.
Well, because if the Pharisees, for example, they believed their interpretation was correct, and on that basis they reject Jesus. Jesus said, "You search the scriptures."
Did you not listen to anything that I said? When Jesus refutes the Pharisees, he says, "A wicked, adulterous generation seeks a sign, seeks the miracles, like you. And none will be given to it but the sign of Jonah," which was what? A thing in the Bible, in the text. Rather, he says that though one rise from the dead, they will not believe. They have Moses and the prophets. Don't you understand that refutes you?
Don't you remember in John 3, Nicodemus said, "We know that you are from God, because no man does the signs that you do unless God is with him."
Correct.
So they were.
So the signs are indicated. No. The signs are indicators that he has that divine power. But the thing that Jesus himself uses is not the signs and the wonders. In fact, he says that signs and wonders are a sign of weakness of faith. You've missed the whole point. A faithless generation seeks signs and wonders, and you want to tell me that that's the way that we prove Catholicism as signs and wonders. So thanks for admitting that you're faithless.
No, I would say so. I would say that Jesus' words apply to like an atheist saying, "Give me a sign." Or if I were to,
he's not talking to atheists. No, he's not talking. That's totally not true.
He's talking to Jews who reject him, who are demanding.
They're not atheists, exactly, not Jews.
I know. But here's the thing.
So the context doesn't matter now to prove your position.
No. My argument to you is not, Jay, prove orthodoxy by doing a sign. I'm not demanding that you give me a sign. I'm telling you that there's.
Of course, we're not saying that. Nobody. Again, that's irrelevant.
No, it's not, because
it is irrelevant.
That would be relevant. That would be me doing what the Jews were doing that Jesus condemned them for, is demanding a sign. But I'm not demanding a sign. Instead, I'm presenting the signs that the Catholic faith brings.
You're missing the whole point. It begs the question, because signs and wonders themselves don't have any meaning without.
So this is something that I care a lot about, and like I said, I've spent a lot of time formulating this argument, and what Jay is doing right here is actually not great. He is conflating induction and deduction, and this is something that I care deeply about, because this is actually an issue that you will see throughout philosophy. Pretty much all philosophers do this at one point or another, where they will conflate induction and deduction. They will make an argument. Or in this case, so Jay is saying you can't prove Catholicism by what you're saying. You can't prove Catholicism from miracles. And the other guy's saying, no, I'm not trying to prove it deductively. I'm just saying that it's evidence, it's inductive evidence. And that confusion between induction and deduction is a perennial mistake that you will see in philosophy. And so it's just worth calling out, because you'll see it here, you'll see it in other debates for sure. Pretty much every single debate I've ever watched at some point makes this mistake, but you'll see it throughout the entire conversation of philosophy, where people will really neglect induction altogether, but when they and use this argument of you can't prove it from that, when that's never what someone is trying to do. They're actually talking inductively, and someone will misunderstand them as talking deductively, and then use that to say they're either begging the question or they're making invalid deductions, when they're never trying to make deductions at all. They're just trying to make inductions. And to go back to what he just said about begging the question does not apply. Begging the question is circular reasoning. When you assume your conclusion, begging the question does not apply when you include induction. Induction breaks out of the syllogistic, the purely deductive system, and now you are actually including information that is non-logical, that is coming from observation, from experience. It's not coming from within this chain of deductions, and begging the question is only a fallacy within your deductions. If you are arguing deductively and you assume your conclusion, then you've made a logical fallacy. But if you are including inductions that happen to relate to your conclusions, you're inducing from your conclusions, that's actually okay, because you are breaking outside of the syllogisms, you're breaking outside of deductions, and so it's okay to include things that are part of your conclusions, to take your conclusions and feed those back into your observations and induce truths from that, and then build on those deductively. That's actually okay. That is not circular reasoning. That is not a fallacious way of thinking, and people will make that mistake all the time, where they will assume that someone is begging the question, when really what they're doing is they're just taking their conclusions, using it to understand their observations better, using that to abstract their presupposition, get their presuppositions more fine-tuned, and then feeding that into the deductive chain. That's not circular reasoning. That's not begging the question.
Well, so I think I get where the Catholic's coming from, because he is trying to use the miracles as supporting of his beliefs, right? But I think Jay's refutation is simply that the miracles themselves don't matter. You can try and cite them as evidence, right? But it's the same thing. If he pulls up a Hindu source, if he pulls up a Gnostic source for a miracle, it's like, well, you can all claim miracles, right? So that's not a great basis for your faith or trying to argue for your position. But
they are evidence. They are evidence, and they're valid evidence, and they're evidence without begging the question. That's what I'm trying to say.
And well, yeah, I think I did tell James he needs to call in on Jay's show specifically
stream you said
for this reason. Yes,
Yeah.
because it would make one fantastic content in and of itself, and it would be fun to then break it down later on to see how off the rails it goes.
I started watching his live streams just to kind of get a sense for how he argues.
Yeah.
So
Well,
hopefully we can
did
do
you
that
watch his one from today?
Not today. No, I think I watched one on Saturday.
Okay. Yeah, but just whenever you feel like it, man, just get a topic, call in, and then I'll just
It'd be
clip it
fun.
out, and we'll
I'm
it'll
sure
be a good
he'd
time.
make fun of me. I'm sure he would get upset just in the same way.
Don't give him a stroke, dude. Please.
Yeah.
The entire context of the paradigm. That's the point. You don't understand that?
I understand that, and I think that the context is Jesus predicted that those who believed in him would do the things that he did.
But
And
that doesn't
that-
prove the position. You don't understand why.
I just don't think that it should be completely discounted.
I didn't discount it. I said that they attend the true faith. They cannot prove it.
But I think when you bring up Deuteronomy the way that you do, it seems that you're just trying to...
The way I do. How does Paul do it in Galatians 1?
In Galatians 1, well, there he says, if someone preaches a different gospel... Do you
No,
believe
that's not all he says. That's not all he says. What does he say?
Yeah, he says, though we are an angel from heaven.
Yeah, so if an angel appears.
Right. Well, okay, so you believe that me distinguishing between something like an exorcism and an apparition is arbitrary, but could you articulate...
You're just picking and choosing the miracles and the signs and the wonders that you want, and you can't even tell me why those are the ones that actually prove it. It's arbitrary. Stop being arbitrary.
Wait, do you genuinely believe I never explained why I think that they're different? Can you...
The argument that you gave was arbitrary. And it rests on the thing that's in question. Because those are the miracles that the Ghostbusters in Rome have investigated and proven.
No, that's not the reason. It's because Jesus himself condemned the Pharisees and warned them about
That
blaspheming
doesn't,
the Holy
no,
Spirit
that doesn't,
because-
dude, that doesn't tell me that your criteria of the ones that count to prove Christianity, the miracles, and the ones that don't, is true.
But, okay, I would say that an angel that appears and preaches a false gospel to you is probably a demon. Would you agree?
That is the point, correct.
Okay, but a demon cannot perform an exorcism, can it?
It's begging the question because, number one, we don't even know if it's a real exorcism. Are you able to go, listen, dude, you're missing the whole point. Are you able to go and investigate every claim of the Roman Catholic Church to see if it really happened? No. So you have to take it on the claims. And the point is that if I'm in a position of hearing 1,000 different claims, whether it's Sai Baba or whether it's the Coptic Church in Egypt, look, all I have to do is tell you, why does Mary's apparition in Zaitun, Egypt not prove Coptic theology? Tell me why.
I haven't looked into that particular example. However,
because it disproves your whole dumb argument.
But well, here's the thing. Also, I'm more, and I think Catholicism is more
Oh my
ecumenical
gosh.
than you. I mean, yeah, we're more ecumenical than you are, right?
As if that proves anything. All that proves is that you're more wrong than we are.
No, it means that I'm open to. They're not with us, but they're casting out devils. in your name.
My position can admit that there's miracles and exorcisms that occur outside the church. I just don't take that as a proof of which one is the true church, because what comes as the proof is, according to Deuteronomy 13, Deuteronomy 18, Galatians 1, the text and the message, not the signs and wonders. And you just bypass every time I quoted to you, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks a sign and a wonder. You argue that that's the thing that proves the true church.
Well, I think that it's a misapplication of that, and the.
How is it a misapplication?
Because the rising. Well, when it comes to the text about rising from the dead, the issue there is people neglecting the poor, not people differing on a.
No, again, that's not what the passage in part is about, the fact that the guy didn't help the poor. But he says, if I rise from the dead, my brothers will believe. Jesus says, though one rise from the dead, they will not believe.
Right. Because,
that refutes you.
But the issue is, do you think that the problem with the rich man was that he had errant theology, or that he was...
Then none of that has anything to do with the point about the miracle itself. You're just deflecting off into the moral of the parable, which is not primarily what we're talking about right now, which is, does a resurrection convince a person to believe?
Well, your tag
Dude,
argument...
so now we're going to go to tag, because, again, you're missing the whole point.
I'm not entirely... I mean, Christ is... In that parable, Christ says you could raise from the dead and they wouldn't believe. That doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't believe. He's just saying that wouldn't convince them psychologically, not necessarily that shouldn't be something that would convince them. I think that he's really condemning them for not believing on the basis of something as obvious as they should have.
He's condemning them because, as he says, they have Moses and the law. Like, they have that already.
Right.
And he's talking to Jews in this circumstance, like, of course they should, like, I am physically here, right?
So I almost feel like Christ is saying they should have been convinced by these things. Yes, they don't prove it, again, deductively, and this is where if you just started using the term deductive and inductive in your day-to-day conversations when you're talking philosophy, it would clear up so much, because I feel like these two guys are just talking past each other completely in terms of which type of
I feel like that
evidence
happens a lot
referring
too.
to. It does.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, this is something that I care about a lot. I really feel like if people would just start to clarify whether or not they're talking about inductive evidence or deductive evidence. I don't even like to call deductions evidence. I think evidence makes more sense to just refer to evidence as being inductive. But
Well, so you're talking about deductive like inference almost.
yeah, well, same thing. Deduction, inference, syllogism, all synonyms, all referring, logic, all referring to this sequence of inevitable, necessary conclusions that must follow from a set of premises. And logic is helpful in terms of clarifying the knowledge that we have from the collection of evidence, from the collection of observations and experiences that we have. We can make abstractions and inductions from this wealth of observation that leads us to have certain presuppositions that we have to accept by faith, and then from there we can do deductions, syllogisms, inferences, and those conclusions must necessarily follow, if they're done correctly, from our presuppositions. But we still have to take our presuppositions on faith, which means that we could be wrong if those presuppositions are wrong. And it makes the deductions somewhat like they're helpful in clarifying a particular perspective. But ultimately, all of the prerequisites for any conclusion that comes from a logical process has to be contained in the premises. Any conclusion, all of the actual information that's there must already be contained in the premises. If you look at Euclidean geometry, all of the conclusions that follow, there are hundreds of conclusions that follow from 10 axioms. But all of so that's the kind of information you get. You can get these hundreds of conclusions, but the information is already baked in to the 10 axioms. So whatever learning you're doing, it can be real learning, but it's clarifying. It's making it sharper. It's making the information sharper and clearer and more easy to use and apply. But you're not actually adding any new information into the system. You only get new information when you accept new axioms or new premises, and that can only be done on the basis of induction.
Sweet. Should we finish out this clip, or do you want to move on to another topic?
Let's we can finish this. It's what, a couple more minutes? I want to see him crash out.
It's like a minute and a half left.
Yeah.
Now listen.
Giving an example.
Again, you understand the easiest way to refute this is Zaytun, Egypt, and that's why you keep going away from it. You don't want to talk about it. Thousands of people in Egypt. Thousands of people in Egypt claim that Mary appeared in Zaytun, Egypt over the Coptic Church. Why should I not be a Coptic?
Because
Silence.
God can perform miracles in other churches.
But dude, are you like a 20 IQ? Seriously, because you just argued that Roman Catholicism is proven by these types of signs and wonders. Now you're saying God can perform the miracles at the Coptic Church, but it doesn't prove Coptic theology.
There's a few qualifiers, but
that's arbitrary. So now you get to tack on the things that. So in other words, miracles don't prove it. We need all this other stuff that's arbitrary from you.
This is unfortunate.
Exactly. I can't think.
He kicks him out. Yeah. That's great.
Heimlich.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I clicked on that debate. My bad.
I do want to watch. I've only gotten partway through the.
I watched the whole thing.
You watched the whole thing? Okay.
I watched the whole thing. It was good.
I want to watch that. Okay. That actually might be fun to do a response to at some point.
No. Because it's 4.5 hours long.
That's true.
So,
do they actually go the entire time?
No, there's like a 5-minute break every hour and a half, I want to say. But no, I was watching it live, but I was like an hour or 2 hours behind. Very good debate from both sides. I thought that they both did a really good job explaining their position. Obviously, like I lean towards the side that Catholicism has some issues when it comes to like Vatican II and some of the earlier documents, whether it's G80, Luma Gentium, all other things, right? And so there's, and obviously I'm not a papist, so I don't believe in the Pope. So I mean, I lean more towards J. Dyer on that, but I think that Tim Gordon did a really good job on that.
Yeah, probably a better J. Dyer debate to do would be J. Dyer and Trent Horn on a natural theology, because that directly feeds
that's
into
kind of what
epistemology,
we're talking about today.
and that is what I'm trying to talk about. And this is what if I call into J. Dyer, it'll be on this topic. I want to understand his apologetic specifically, because apologetics necessarily follows from your epistemology. And as I understand, J. Dyer is something of a presuppositionalist, which is most associated with the Protestant Van Til. And you get Bonson and several kind of disciples from Van Til, and Francis Schaeffer even had his own brand of presuppositionalism. In some respects, I guess I kind of fall into the presuppositionalist camp in my own epistemology, but I reject the Van Tilian concept of basically the defense of presuppositionalism that's generally given by presuppositionalists is a fallacious circular reasoning, and they say that all reasoning is actually circular, and that's what I just reject. And I don't think that a proper presuppositionalist view is actually circular. As long as you start to include induction in its right context into the conversation, it clarifies a lot of your epistemology. And I'm really curious where Jay would fall into that whole conversation. I'm also just curious where orthodoxy in general, if you're a presuppositionalist orthodox, how much of Van Tilian...
They reject natural theology and Greek philosophy.
Which Van Til would as well, but I'm just curious how much, what else carries over, if he is citing people like Van Til and Bonson, or if there's a unique brand of orthodox presuppositionalism that I'm not even aware of that comes before Van Til. I don't know. I'm curious sort of whether he falls into the same school of thought philosophically as Van Til and sort of his descendants, or something different. So I don't know. It'd be an interesting conversation. Hopefully I can talk with
100%.
Jay at some point.
Yeah, and I mean he streams like 3 to 5 times a week. So
yeah. I'll
jumping
find
in
time
there and trying to do it. Yeah.
So let's
Telling
talk
you, man,
for a
it'll
second.
be a good time.
Yeah. Go ahead and pull up the slideshow again. So I want to talk just for a little bit more about metaphor and meaning, and this word that we have of real, and whether or not the metaphorical thing is real or the spiritual thing is real. So I've mentioned this a little bit in the past, but I wanted to clarify a little bit what I was talking about with some slides and some illustrations. So just to dive in, metaphors can only go so far in describing something truly. So for example, you can describe God as being a rock, and this is true with regard to his steadfastness or the fact that he's a shelter. This is how it's typically used in Scripture when they talk about God as being a rock. But obviously, the metaphor breaks down when you talk about God's love or his personhood or his eternality. These things do not relate to a rock. And so all metaphors go so far, but not farther. There is always a point of departure when it comes to metaphorical speech. All right, so when it comes to rock, you've got this smaller physical thing called a rock, and then you have this much larger thing that is God, and there is God is sort of part of God could be described with this rock, but the metaphor breaks down pretty quickly. So go to the next slide. All right, so here we've got the point of departure. Let's see. It's the first one. Okay, there we go. So we've got the point of departure. You can see the distinction between the physical and the spiritual. So God is spirit, so he would fall into the spiritual category. Although the incarnation kind of throws a monkey wrench in that, because now all of a sudden you have God entering into the physical world, which is it starts to break down this entire concept of metaphor, and it really, that's why the incarnation in any system of theology must be a mystery, because it destroys any way of philosophically thinking about these things. All right, so go to the next slide. Next. Yeah, I just hit it. So when you talk about, go back. Yeah, it's just one at a time. So when you talk about God as Father, the question is that the same kind of thing where it's similar to like rock? Is that just a metaphor to refer to God? We've talked about this in a previous stream, but the answer is no. Father is this our human concept of Father is not the ultimate concept of Father that we can talk about in the same way, where it's just sort of an anthropomorphism, as we might say, where there's a point of departure where it goes so far in terms of we can relate our concept of Father to God, but we can't go any farther because God doesn't propagate through sexual means, or all the things that we think about when we think about the definition of Father. That would be one way to think of it, but that's the wrong way to think of it. You actually have to flip the metaphor. So go to the next, hit it again. There we go. You have to flip the metaphor and realize that the real concept of Father, what is real when we think about Father, is Godness, and when he talks about himself as the Heavenly Father, he is the archetypal Father, and the metaphor is really the physical. Now the metaphor is flowing in the other direction. When we talk about rock and God, the metaphor flows from rock to God, in the sense that it goes so far but not beyond that. Well, now the term Father goes so far in the other direction but not beyond that, and so we can only participate in some of God's ultimate fatherness, but we can't participate in all of that. And so we can be fathers in a physical sense, but not in an ultimate sense. And so some metaphors go this way, some metaphors go that way. Rock goes that way, Father goes this way. And there's always going to be a point of departure between the physical and the spiritual. So hit the next one. Right. So the question is what is real? Which one is more real? And that the direction of the arrow is kind of what indicates which one is going to be the more real. And so in some cases, when we talk about like rock, it almost seems like a rock is the real thing. And when we just use that to describe God, the rock is still the real thing. But when we talk about Father, it's like the real Father is God, not us. Whereas when we talk about rock, the real rock in a definition of rock is the physical thing, and so which direction is reality going? All right, keep going. Hopefully this is making some sense. So another example I like to give is when we talk about Genesis 1, the days of creation. This is a big debate in Catholic, Protestant, pretty much all Christian circles. You'll have proponents of both views when it comes to what Genesis 1 means by day. Some people hold to a literal 24-hour days, and some people hold to more of a metaphorical day, or more of a poetic day. Now, regardless of your exact position, I think that the metaphor flowing from day to the days of creation as used in Genesis 1, that's the wrong direction of the metaphor. The metaphor should flow from days of creation to the days in Genesis 1. In other words, or a 24-hour day. When we use the term 24-hour day, we shouldn't think of it like a rock. We should think of it more like the term Father, where our 24-hour days are participating in some concept of day that is established in God's act of creation, where he's setting a pattern, an eternal pattern in place that we then get to participate in, and our 24-hour days participate in that pattern as it's established in God's creative work. Now, when you just think of the minutia, it does seem a little bit preposterous to me that you have a 24-hour day prior to the sun being created, which is the whole, the sun and the earth's relationship is where we get the 24 hours from. Now, God certainly could be looking at a spiritual clock and marking his work by this 24-hour thing that he knew that he was going to create in his foreknowledge. That certainly is possible. And then, of course, Moses, writing much later, could have used that word day to refer to something, literally 24-hour days like we currently understand them. But I just think that that's trying to get into the minutia of that is missing the point. God is setting a pattern of work, of days, of 6 days that you labor, and then 1 day you rest. And then this thing that we experience as days in our life is participating in that pattern and in that metaphor. And so again, in this case, when we talk about the days, the word day, as it's used in Genesis 1, our concept of day is participating in something that is greater than our concept of day. And so the point of departure is going to be, well, it's hard to exactly know where the point of departure is, but regardless of where it is, the metaphor flows in this direction from God's concept of day to our concept of day. The spiritual is the more real. Okay, so then go to the next slide. So when it comes to transubstantiation, when it comes to the bread and the body, that gets a lot more complicated, because now we're talking about something, it's hard to tell where the exact point of departure is, and there is an essential equation being set up. We could talk about it in terms of metaphorical. Maybe Christ was speaking metaphorically, and saying that, my body is the bread, in a metaphorical sense, so it goes this far, but no farther than this, so it goes this far in terms of the substance, but not the accidents, right? That would be the Catholic perspective. And so that has the metaphor flowing in this direction, from God, from the spiritual to the material, whereas Protestants would often more think of it as being, at least in the mere memorial perspective, would flow in the other direction, where you have it from the physical to the spiritual. But I'm concerned that perhaps neither of these fully describes what's going on. Certainly, if you think of it as being hit the next two. Is the point I was making earlier about whether or not transubstantiation is something of an incarnational act, and transubstantiation, as described by Catholics, can't be. The answer would be no, because the incarnation involves taking on the accidents, whereas in transubstantiation, as it normally occurs, does not take on the accidents of God. The accidents remain breadly, whereas the substance is now godly. So I'm not entirely convinced that I think the Orthodox are right, that it's a mystery, that we can't fully understand how to parse the metaphor from the literal, or even how to separate those two concepts when we're talking about something that is so spiritually laden. It's just dripping with spirituality. You cannot escape the spiritual significance of what's happening here. And so to try to speak in terms of what is metaphor and what is literal gets very, very difficult.
So my question do you think he was speaking metaphorically when he said, "Drink my blood and eat my flesh"? Because he never encouraged his followers to stray from Old Testament law. And even when he did say these things, he lost a lot of followers, and people looked at him like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not supposed to drink blood. Like, that's Old Testament law. So is this like the only instance where he tells them to stray away from old law? So was he not speaking metaphorically? Like, is my question.
What would you say? What would your answer be?
I would say he's speaking literal, because this is probably the only instance where he's telling his followers to stray from Old Testament law.
So you were saying, yes, it is an example, a distinction. I don't know, because it seems to me like the Old Testament law would still be referring primarily to the accidents. So I'm not sure exactly how that, it doesn't, Christ came to fulfill the law, not to
That's true. Yeah.
reject it. So I'm not, I'm not particularly convinced by the argument that this was a hard saying, therefore he must be meaning transubstantiation. Like, I think that it's a hard saying because it's hard to understand. And so, yeah, I can understand people walking away because they just had no clue what he was talking about. I don't think, and it does sound cannibalistic, so that could be part of the issue, but it's not cannibalistic, right? In any true understanding of it. So no matter what, I think the people that walked away didn't understand it, and that ultimately is why they walked away. Yeah. So again, I'm not exactly sure where I fall into sort of how you square the circle, so to speak. It is a complex issue, and I think that ultimately you just kind of have to throw your hands up and say this is mysterious, and the equation between body and bread is perhaps not open to as much penetration as I would argue the Catholics attempt. That's the end of my slideshow. John, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think I'm more in line with you in that, where it seems like it is very difficult and muddy for us in our human paradigm to understand exactly what is happening in the Eucharist, whether it is this sort of mystical changing of the bread, the substance of the bread and the wine into Christ's body and blood, whether it is a spiritual realness that we accept, whether it's only Christians who can partake in it. I do think that there is sort of an unknowable aspect to it, if that makes sense. Like it is otherworldly in that sense. So,
are you guys hearing a cricket in my
yes,
in my mic?
I've been hearing that cricket for the past 45
that's
minutes.
Funny. Surprised that doesn't get kicked out with the the StreamYard has really good audio background audio removing technology, but sorry. Can't do
when
anything
you
about the
stop
cricket.
talking, it's gone. But when like it's gone, and then as soon as you say anything, it's just right back. But yeah, I mean, so transubstantiation, it's kind of, it is the same thing almost. If you want to broaden your perspective a little bit on it, where it's only the accidents stay the same, but the substance changes. But if the accidents, the attributes that we can see are all the same, except for in the Eucharistic miracle sense, right? Where the accidents actually change to where it can be a noticeable difference. I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say it's a distinction without a difference, because it is difference, or, I don't want to say it's like the consubstantiation route, Zwingli's methodology, but it is very close.
Consubstantiation is Luther's.
Luther's,
but mere memorial would be Zwingli, yeah. Yeah, I think that's about right.
And again, as a Protestant, I don't have to accept either, right? But as a Catholic, you can't deny transubstantiation.
No.
Which and again, even from where I'm sitting, transubstantiation wouldn't be a crazy leap at all, but it would just be a hard definition. I suppose this is the difference between, like, if you have a normative authority, which is the Catholic Church, they say this is what it is, and you say, okay, fair enough. Or if you don't have individual certainty, right? So can I individually know that this is the exact process that is happening in the Eucharist when I partake in it? Like, probably not, but I can have a normative authority that tells me, yes, this is what it is, so it is. And I think that's perfectly fine for the layperson to just be like, this is what my priest says, therefore, this is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that when I have, because I used to not understand transubstantiation, and so I had a Catholic friend, and we sat down for, I don't know, a good 30, 40 minutes and just hashed it all out. And by the end of it, I came away thinking, okay, I think we're basically 90% aligned. And now I'd actually almost would say maybe 95% of the way aligned. It just seems like there's maybe a 5% issue it seems superstitious to me within Catholicism, but really, at the time, I thought that maybe
I would say it's more defined almost, because if you take the mystical interpretation, you are leaving something up to mystery.
Well, yeah, you're thinking of superstition in a different way than I was thinking. I guess I was thinking, at the time, I was thinking that Catholics still believed that there was an actual physical transformation that took place. Like, it wasn't like the accidents did actually transform. And since then, I've realized that no, Catholics, except in extraordinary cases, don't even believe that. And so really,
Correct,
that
yeah.
was the 10% superstition that I was thinking. And I'm sure there were plenty of first generation Catholics that believed that the accidents changed. There are plenty of Catholics today that believe the accidents change, right? They hear about the Eucharistic miracles and they just assume that that's what normally occurs, right? That it does transform in their,
I was going to say that too. Most of these miracles that have happened to desecrated hosts. So, so
exactly,
yeah.
right. Which is why I included that fourth point in my, when I have my four commonly held views on the Eucharist in terms of what how the bread and body are how the body and blood are the bread and wine. I include symbolically and truly and literally and physically, because there are plenty of Christians that do actually hold to that view, just no institutions that officially hold to that view. So there are plenty of people that sort of misunderstand their doctrine. But you remove that, and I think really I don't with a deeper understanding of what substance means, I'm not exactly sure how you parse that from Calvin's conception of spirituality, of a real spiritual presence. It's like we're talking about something that is non-material. It sounds like spiritual to me, and is real and true. And so I think, assuming you're rejecting Platonism, which would say that the most real is always the non-material, right? Plato's idea of the forms is that there are these, there's a perfect triangle, a form of a triangle, an idea of a triangle that exists in the world of the forms, that all triangles that we see are simply examples of, imperfect examples of this perfect form, the triangle. Whereas Aristotle said, no, you can't say that. In fact, the universals are real, but they're real in the examples, right? So Aristotle they call him like a soft idealist, although some people would call him like a soft nominalist. But basically, Aristotle, he recognized the existence of the universals, the concept of triangle, but he saw there is no concept of triangle without examples of triangles. He saw the universals as being real as they were demonstrated in the physical things that we saw around us. But in order to know whether or not a thing is a triangle, you still have to have a concept of triangle. And where do you get that concept of triangle if you're only looking in a purely materialistic, purely what's the term I'm looking for? Empiricist way? You still have to ask, where do the universals come from? What is the standard of triangle? What is this? Where does the standard for anything come from? And so it's not quite clear. I mean, the best answer that is given in philosophy is the mind of God. The universals exist in the mind of God, which sounds a lot like Plato's idea of the world of the forms. It's like the world of the forms is the mind of God, which is basically what Augustine would have said. But then, but still, if you just elevate the world of the forms as being the most real and neglect the material as being real, you end up in a place that is not wholly Christian. Christianity, one of the key innovations that Christianity makes when it comes to taking Hellenistic philosophy and improving it, is to emphasize the importance of the material, the importance of the world around us, which is something of an Aristotelian innovation. But then Christianity goes even farther. Thomas Aquinas takes Aristotle and uses his philosophy in a Christian context, and Christians emphasize the importance of the material. We do not simply reject the material in favor of the spiritual, but we actually see them as being both part of the real. And that is the key. I think the cricket's gone. Is it? You guys still hearing the cricket? I don't hear it.
A little bit, yeah. He's arguing with you.
Yeah. All right, but anyway, so that's key. It's key to Christianity that we do not think of the spiritual as being the most real. We do see both material and spiritual as being real, and exactly how they relate is still up for debate. There's still a lot of conversation that takes place around that, and this particular discussion of transubstantiation is part of that larger conversation.
Yep. Well, as I said, it was going to be a very heavy topic.
Yeah.
Not quite as bad as arguing over one word in Greek for two hours, but
yeah.
Yes. All right, are we out of clips? Is that everything?
Yeah, I think
covered all the official content.
That was what everybody brought for today, and I think that exhausted the different perspectives on the Eucharistic miracles, and we got a full sermon in there basically.
Yeah.
Thanks, James. Maybe not a sermon, maybe a lecture.
Well, you've reminded me. There was one thing I wanted to say that is more sermonic, and this is just something that was mentioned. The sermon today was on the Lord's Supper, and there was just one little devotional thing that I think is it really made an impact on me. There's a line in Jeremiah 2. I forget the exact reference, but in Jeremiah 2, where he says, a bride will not forget her jewelry when going, on her wedding day. But you have forgotten me, right? This is Jeremiah talking about the people of Israel. And this is God talking through Jeremiah about how the people of Israel, even though, a bride isn't going to forget something as trivial as her jewelry, the people of Israel have forgotten God. And then you relate that to Christ saying, do this in remembrance of me. That really, you can feel the pain in God's voice when he's talking to the people of Israel, saying, you've forgotten me. You'll remember something as trivial as jewelry, but you've forgotten me. You don't think about me on a day-to-day basis. And how true could this be of us, even in our day-to-day lives, when we forget the God who allows us to breathe every second. And so, do this in remembrance of me is not a trivial command. We must remember God. We must. We cannot forget this God that we worship. And you think even if Christ's words, when right after that is the Garden of Gethsemane. And the disciples are falling asleep while Christ is in agonizing prayer, sweating drops of blood. They're already forgetting what they should be thinking about. And so just to emphasize the importance of this conversation, the importance of, regardless of where you stand on transubstantiation, the importance of the act, the ritual of the Lord's Supper. It is a key moment of remembrance and not something to be forgotten. So There you go. I thought that was a really good message, and I just wanted to share that.
That was great.
Sweet. Heck yeah.
Before we go, is Hook still in the chat? I want to know how that Lutheran service went.
Yeah, he was here just a few minutes ago. So Hook, yeah, how was your Lutheran service?
Yeah.
My sermon, not my sermon, but the sermon I was at today was on John 6, 1 through 7. It's the woman caught in adultery. What about you, Christian? What was your homily on?
Let me look it up. Let's see. It was on the verse where Christ says, "I do not know you. Depart from me." Forget where that is.
Heavy topic, yeah.
Yeah, I have not done much research on that one, so it was interesting.
Yeah, that's a worthwhile topic for another stream, because it goes into the question of what really is required for salvation, and it touches on the question that is very important with regard to Vatican II of, can you be saved potentially without knowing the name of Christ, right? If there are some people who know the name of Christ but that aren't saved, Christ's words seem to also imply maybe that there are people that don't necessarily know his name, or don't necessarily have perfect theology that maybe are saved. That might be too much of an extrapolation from that particular passage, but there's a whole question around the people that through natural religion alone, and they'd be brought to God, through, even no one gets to the Father but through Christ, but we don't, C.S. Lewis talks about how we don't know the exact mechanism by which we get to the Father through Christ, right? We know that it has to be through Christ, and even the Catholic Church will say it has to be through the Catholic Church. But in Vatican II, the Catholic Church seems to say that there might be other ways of getting through the church, and and do Muslims worship the same God, and all of that is contained within the same
all the denominations,
conversation.
when you boil down to it, they all say that there are extra normative means of grace, right? Where Christ, through again an extra normative mean, can save people outside of the church, but that's not a great bet. I think that's what everybody would argue.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Looking at our starred comments before we go here, we had a couple comments on Calvin. Someone talking about, one of the differences between Calvin and Luther was that Calvin believed that the real presence, the real spiritual presence, as Calvin would have said in his Institutes, was only present for believers, whereas for unbelievers who should be, fenced from the table when they took it and ate and drank judgment on themselves, the judgment was from God, but they weren't actually consuming Christ in the same way that believers were, whereas Luther would have said, no, regardless of whether you are a believer or unbeliever, you are consuming Christ, and that's why you get judgment, because you improperly consumed the real presence. I tend to think the latter is probably more valid. I do think that if you hold to a high view of the real presence, even a real spiritual presence, it does seem like the condemnation on people that do it incorrectly would imply that there is the presence is there, whether you believe or not, and that's why there's the condemnation. But I'm not entirely sure where I fall, but that is an interesting distinction, and I think that comment is correct. And then Full Metal Jacket said that he has no respect for Calvin, which is a problem. Come on, man. Calvin is often misrepresented.
Completely hates anything Calvinistic.
Well, and Catholics often do as well, although, like I said, true Thomism is a lot closer to Calvinism than many Catholics realize. Orthodox probably don't have that same link, and so they don't have to worry about it.
They reject Thomism as well. So.
But the one thing I'll say about Calvinism is most people understand Calvinism through the 5 points, right? TULIP, the 5 points of Calvinism, as they're often called. Those 5 points were never stated by Calvin. There's a whole question, there's a big debate about whether or not Calvin himself would have been a 4-point Calvinist or a 5-point Calvinist, right? The 5 points of Calvinism, as they are termed, derive from a post-Calvinistic synod that occurred in Dort, the Synod of Dort, and it is a reaction to the 5 points of Arminianism, which no one here should be an Arminian. Not Armenians, the nationality, but Arminians, the people that believe in that are anti-predestination and pure free will. The 5 points of Calvinism are a reaction to the 5 points of Arminianism, and are in no way a complete summation of Calvin's theology. And there's even a question of whether or not they are a good approximation of what Calvin would have thought in terms of specifically the limited atonement, I think is the big question in whether or not you're a 4-point Calvinist or a 5-point Calvinist. I tend to be a 5-point Calvinist, but I think that there are some valid critiques of the concept of limited atonement, and perhaps it might be better left up to mystery, which I think what the 4-point Calvinists would say. But all that said, Calvin himself was a serious thinker. If you actually read Calvin himself, he is not nearly as objectionable as a lot of people are led to believe in their sort of common understanding of his theology. And you certainly can't just go to the 5 points of TULIP to understand all of Calvin's thinking. He also had plenty of problems. He was very proud, very stuck up in a lot of ways, and needed a little bit of humility. He got a little bit of humility at different parts in his life, but he remained a little bit stodgy, as the British might say. So there you go. But don't discount Calvin. He's nice. He's good.
He's a nice guy. That's funny.
I'm done.
All
Thanks,
right,
guys.
Well, let's get out of here, bros. 2.5 hours on the dot.
Good stuff. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We had good attendance throughout, even though we didn't have the kick from Focus Chip's regular stream. I think we're gonna keep doing Sunday at least. We do have a couple plans for some midweek streams as well. I know we've got at least one in the works with someone that might have an inside take on Mormonism, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, do expect us at the very least next Sunday, if not before, and we will see you next time. God bless.
Yep. God bless.